We are called to do hard things,
Mm.
and caregiving can be hard. And sometimes we are the recipients of the culmination of lots of difficulties and lots of strains, and among others, and that bounces back against us. I don't think it's about holding grudges.
Yeah.
It's certainly an acknowledgement, and there's nothing like, I think we're called as caregivers and professionals to be introspective and return back to a difficult situation with a conversation that, shows a willingness to negotiate.
Welcome to the From Guilt to Good podcast, where we discuss all things caregivers wish people would talk about, but don't, won't, or can't. Hi, my name is Jeanette Yates, and I'm a lifelong caregiver for my mom and founder of The Self-Caregiver, where I help caregivers feel good, not guilty. And in this week's episode, we are talking to Mark Ropeleski. He's the host of the Caregivers Podcast. He's an MD working in internal medicine and gastroenterology, and he's been doing that for 32 years. Mark is an educator, a researcher, training program director, mentor, DIY investor in others, advocate, colleague, father, and friend. And I'm so glad to call him my friend and welcome him here today. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, Jeanette. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm thrilled that you were able to jump in and do this podcast episode with me under such short notice.
It's actually a pleasure. We've had the great chance to speak previously, and obviously you've been a guest on my podcast, and it's wonderful to return the favor, but also to sort of have a chance to maybe talk about things from out of a different perspective. So it's great to be here, and I appreciate your support.
Yeah. So your podcast, the Caregivers Podcast, just started a little bit ago, but you've had a lot of great guests on there so far. I think you're 5 or 6 episodes in as of the time of this recording, and everyone has been, not tooting my own horn, but all of them have been really great conversations and you go really in depth, which I love. And for those caregivers out there that are like, oh, I can't do a long podcast, it's okay. You don't have to listen to it all in one sitting. I never do. Check those out. And I'll be sure to add that stuff in the show notes of this episode when we get there. All right. So the first thing I always do when I have a guest on is I usually ask them to talk about their caregiving experience. And as a doctor, your caregiving experience is a little bit different. So I want you to tell me a little bit more about your background and then why you decided to start your podcast for caregivers.
Sure. Well, thanks for the warm welcome. It's really been and still is kind of a work in progress. I entered medical training in my late teens and graduated as a young physician at age 23 and took a journey thereafter in internal medicine and gastroenterology, as you pointed out. And then actually, and maybe it was reflective of the fact that I graduated a bit younger than my cohort, spent 5 additional years doing research at McGill University in Montreal for 2 of them, and then 3 years at the University of Chicago, and came back to Kingston, Ontario, to Queen's University to set up a clinician scientist program where I took on this ultimate challenge to raise a young family displaced from home and take on the amazing adventure of actually doing research and being a clinician and actually doing research in the area of my specialty, which was Crohn's and colitis. So it was a dynamic, high stress, heavy burden, adrenaline pumping sort of initial career experience. But in terms of caregiving, by default, we sort of are caregivers in the sense that we certainly care what we do and we give so much of ourselves. But I witnessed a lot of caregiving growing up. My dad was a caregiver for his parents and extended family. And actually, when my father passed away, he was still a caregiver for one of those 4 individuals, that is his parents and an uncle and an aunt. And he actually was outlived by one of the people he was caring for. And so in retrospect, I've sort of been exposed to, the giving and the caring and self-sacrifice as I witnessed as a son in my dad's own trajectory. And I'm sure that somehow along the way informed how I approached my caregiving and my evolution, and both a caregiver to others, family, friends, and professionally, and not a very good caregiver to myself. So it was sort of an adventure that took on different shapes, but also different habits. And one of the habits of, lack of self-care definitely came home to roost. And it wasn't that I wasn't interested in doing things for myself or interested in the things that I was passionate about. I just very conveniently rationalized that there was no time for that. And there were other callings that were a bigger priority. And when it came time to sort of think about those things, my giving and providing to others usually took precedent over myself.
So before I hit record, we talked about what we were going to talk about, and I've already changed my mind. But not really, but I do want to, before I go to the next thing that I wanted to talk to you about, I do want to hone in a little bit on what you just said about that rationalization piece that every caregiver can relate to, where we rationalize that we do not have the time, or it would be selfish to, or there's some kind of reason that we give ourselves for not being able to do the things, like you mentioned, that we already know that we could, should, or perhaps even want to be doing. Why do you think we are so prone to do that? Do you have any theories?
Well, I think habits are formed at a young age. I think we speak and read about socialization and the initial blueprints we are all afforded by our early experiences and with family, and whether it's financial blueprints or emotional blueprints or giving blueprints. And I think once we realize that they serve purpose and they might actually fuel other positive attributes, you sort of get into this self-fulfilling prophecy. So, I've been asked, well, why did I go into medicine? I think I had a lot of positive experiences as a young person, as a teenager and young adult, as a listener and someone who cared. And that came very naturally. And I think a lot of that was informed by experiences growing up with some of the tumult that sort of arose in my own family. Caregiving for others, that was sort of an important and obvious sort of feature of our family life, because extended family were targets of a lot of giving. And in hindsight, recognizing that a lot of that was probably informed by my father's own generational trauma, I think I learned at a young age that actually it's kind of like what you alluded to in one of our discussions previously. Be good in school, do these things, and don't rock the boat, and everything stays smooth. And my sort of personality allowed me to translate that into a currency. And it wasn't about doing well. It was that doing well kept the peace, and it kept things going smoothly. And eventually you sort of get flow. You get the satisfaction as well of, the positive reinforcement of doing well onto others as you'd hope to be done onto yourself. But very quickly you can get lost, because it becomes a very easily accessible currency or solution to scenarios. And before you know it, it doesn't become, it's not about putting yourself first, but it's at least accounting for yourself. And it can be very quickly lost in the shuffle. And at one point, it actually becomes rationalized. And then you find yourself down the line sort of saying, I've amassed all of these experiences, but why do I feel hollow? Or where have I ended up in all of this? Whether if that's a stereotypical midlife crisis, which I think is, that word has been so overused and probably has 100 definitions, but it's that moment of probably introspection where you sort of, wonder why, how, and where am I in all of this? And then, I'm probably halfway through the journey. But I think a lot of it was informed by those early experiences, and it just kind of snowballs forward.
Yeah. I love that you're talking about it in that way. And I think too, we have this, it's hard sometimes to have nuance in a world that is more and more and more. And maybe it's just my perception that's more because this is the time I'm living in, right? But there's a lot of black and white thinking now, it seems. Like I said, seems like there's more of that. And so then when we come into thinking about our caregiving, it's like we're either giving it all or it's nothing. It's all or nothing. It's, we're selfish or selfless. And it's like, well, And there's this idea of, it is part of our role as adult children to care for our loved ones. And that sentence has its own, we could spend a whole hour on that. But
Sure.
also, it's also our role to raise our children well, or it's also our role in our job, whatever. So we have all these different things that are saying, this is what you should be doing. And if you're not doing this, you're all the way 180 degrees away from
exactly.
this.
And it's the same in healthcare these days.
Right.
We're saying if you're not doing it all, you're lazy. And as you say, that black and white thinking really sort of creates conflict and establishes these very polar categories. At the same time, black and white thinking is a cognitive flaw. And that's been, well studied in the literature. It's interesting how we get to those points and you look back and realize that it was just part of a process that was reinforced, but it wasn't maleficent, or it wasn't the blueprint that was established wasn't based on some secondary gain or some nasty perspective that you were going to become this disadvantaged caregiver later in life. I mean, most of the time it's not narcissistically informed or other personality traits that you face as a young person that may shape how you approach your caregiving later in life. Sometimes it is, and that's really unfortunate. And there are lots of things written about surviving, narcissistic abuse and narcissistic parenting when you're young. And fortunately, that's been well researched, and there's lots of help available for people contending with that. But I think what we're talking about here is a little bit of a different story. But it has the capacity to pass through generations, and it affects one's parenting, or at least experiences of having been parented, and it may also inform how you may parent. And wrapped in there is that whole notion of care, because your first experiences of care are probably from your parents.
Yeah. So, and one of the things that I've really noticed over just my own decades-long experience of caregiving, and then just talking with so many other caregivers is, even looking back my own story, I can say, like, I had this idea in my head that I had to be a good little girl and do a good job for mom so that she wouldn't get worse. And, but like, I don't know that someone explicitly said, if you make bad grades, your mom's going to die.
Right.
However, in my understanding at the time, that is what I internalized. And so I think, to your point, those messages, whether they're intentionally put in your brain or it's just how you understand, the messages that you're receiving, it can cause that, so as an adult caregiver for my mom, I was still wrestling with that. If you're not doing XYZ in caregiving, she could die. If you don't do this. And then like it got from like the big things that are like, obviously she needs her medication, she needs to go to the hospital when there's an emergency, to like, if I don't do this one thing for her convenience, that is not being a good caregiver. And that was a really hard thing for me to try to parse out, is like, I want to be a good caregiver. And I know that to her, all of these things seem like they're part of the caregiving role, but I can't do them all. And I think that was a really hard a nuance that I had to discover for myself. And what it looked like for my caregiving relationship certainly looks different for other people's. But like,
absolutely,
to learn how to navigate, saying no, like, I think boundary setting and caregiving is so hard because you're actually saying no to someone who believes who needs you. You're saying no to someone who needs you. So how do you do that, but still say yes
to yourself,
to myself, but also like, still give good, even, setting boundaries while still being able to give good care. And that was so hard. And what helped me is learning that two seemingly opposite things could be true at the same time. So it didn't have to be all or nothing. It didn't have to be go over there every night or never go over there at all. It didn't have to be, it could,
Yes.
it could be fluid, it could be nuanced. And that took a little bit more energy at first to figure out, because I wanted just to
Hmm.
go, I'm coming over every night, I'm not coming over, or I'm coming over 3 nights a week, or I'm not coming over 3 nights, like I wanted to flip the switch on and flip it off. But that wasn't appropriate for our situation. And so I had to make more difficult choices. They got easier as I practiced them, but it was definitely that more nuanced conversation I had to have in my head, and then also with my mom. But I think, to my point, and what I wanted to like get to with you, and I think we've discussed this well, is just this idea of, we want rules. We want rules that we can follow, that will let us know if we just follow these rules, we're going to be good
Hmm.
caregivers. And that's not a good recipe, I don't think, for being a good caregiver, because
Well,
it
it
doesn't allow for
biases
nuance.
us. Yeah,
Yeah.
it biases us cognitively too, I think, because it's, as you were alluding to, you either wanted it one way or the other, and the crystal ball of the moment would hopefully shed light of how it's going to be. But you really said you need to sort of test it, try it, and find out how it fits. And probably most of the time, the fit's not too bad, and it's certainly one that you can rationalize and can be mutually acceptable to whoever you're caregiving to,
Right.
and yourself. But it is a process. It's a process learning to let go of some of those constraints and rules that you abide by in your caregiving role onto others, your loved ones, or your patients, your clients. If you're in a caregiving profession that's non-medical or non-nursing, there are lots of other people who by nature care deeply and give of themselves to their profession or to their cause. That testing process of finding the right balance is really, I think, foundational. And no one tells us to take a cognitive inventory when we're 25. It's like you're 25, you're probably going places, trying things out. You might be in relationships, you're forging forward with career, thinking about other things, perhaps a family. Let's take the cognitive inventory and see where the thinking flaws are, or let's at least look and say, maybe we can free up a bit of energy and a bit more ability to take care of ourselves in preparation for the future by letting go some of those micro residues of trauma that we grew up with. And, not in some big bombastic explosion, but just sort of a gentle letting go and acknowledgement, and doing so in a way that's determined, but yet gentle, especially to yourself, because very often we're not used to being gentle to ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think that it could have a huge impact. And I think a lot of that's really informed what I've tried to do, because it was my own experience that sort of awakened me to, when you actually heal, space opens up.
Yeah.
And in a society and a way of life, no matter what we do, where we feel time is never available,
Mm.
when you heal and that space opens up, you have the choice to actually use that space for the time that you've never taken for yourself. And it doesn't mean going away to Tahiti for 6 months. It's
Right.
about finding time and confidence to test, to rebuild the most basic of habits that allow you to return to some medium of self-care. And it was only when I realized that it was just like one of those wow moments that, it changed my life for sure. And it actually happened right where I'm sitting on a Saturday morning in March of 2023, having read Terry Real's book, I Don't Want to Talk About It. Here I was, thinking about, my experience as a child, what my children experienced with me, and my understanding of my father's story. And, within just a moment in time, there was this little boy, my father, sitting on my lap, my arms around him. And I'm not one to sort of have experience or have had experiences like this through my life. But in that moment, that hug to that child sitting on my lap was a hug of forgiveness and understanding. And everything changed. And a lot of tears followed, but they were the most liberating tears of my life. And that's when my life changed. And it affected, I'd already gone through a burnout back in 2019, just having had way too much stuff on my plate, way too many things I was doing really well. And that was never the issue. It wasn't for the goodwill or the recognition of the value of the offering, but it was just too much. But with time thereafter, and then obviously the pandemic and the changes and some changes in family dynamics and other things, it was when I had that realization, having started to take the time to do some reading and getting some coaching with some therapy as well, and having been pointed in that direction, that book really turned the corner. That and Michael Singer's book, The Untethered Soul.
Yes. We'll link both of those in the show notes as well.
Yeah, wonderful. Just wonderful. It was the experience that I needed. Yet I always thought I had the currency of giving as my solution to making it through all this. And, that kind of backfired on me. I've got to be honest. I mean, I still caregive. I look after my mom, and I'm a fully active clinician with this podcast as being, weekend and evening work.
Yeah.
For the most part, it just sort of came to fruition, having gone through that realization and having been a program director, having had trainees about to launch into their careers and having mentored them for about a decade. It first started as an idea, well, I need to offer this to the young people I'm most familiar with, that is medical trainees. But then through some serendipitous introductions and coffee chats with others, and then eventually meeting who's now my producer, Fred, we had some serious talks about the scope of the experience. And I think came to a realization that there's more to the story here.
Yeah.
And it took on a shape that it wasn't about medical practice. It was about other oriented practice and giving of self. And it really could potentially be boundaryless. And it applies to non-professional caregivers, family caregivers, the whole professional gamut. And I think that's really inspired our vision for bringing people to the podcast to have talks and discoveries of what it's all about. It's what brought us to your story, what brought us to the nurses we've interviewed in the last couple of weeks. We just interviewed the head and the media chief from the Manitoba Nurses Union yesterday and had a wonderful encounter. It just, it's an understanding of caregiving and giving of oneself in the context of all kind of societal environments, and that one obviously being nursing, but there's so many others. And I think united, there are a lot of common themes, and there's a lot of common understanding that can be shared so that everybody doesn't feel alone. Because alone in caregiving is probably the worst place you can be.
Well, and it's interesting that you said that. I'm going to make one point, and then we're going to actually jump into this different types of caregiving piece. But I think that I was speaking with a caregiving company the other day, and we were just talking about better ways to serve the caregivers that they serve. And, and they were like, well, we need to figure out what they need, other than what they're already doing. So they were doing A, and they were like, we could give them more. So let's figure out what that next thing is. And I said, that I can tell you what it is. They don't want to feel alone. Your caregivers, the people that people that are listening to this podcast, the people that are Googling things about caregiving, the people, they don't want to feel alone, and they want to know that they're not in it alone. And sometimes that means finding a support group. Sometimes that means finding in-home care. And sometimes that means finding, that means I don't want to feel alone in caring for my loved one. So I need to find professional care for them in home, in a place, whatever, respite care. But it all goes back to that, like in my, like deep down is like this, it's that I don't want to feel alone in this. I don't want to feel like, and some, and in some cases like me, I didn't have I had family support, but I didn't have family that could step in and help, And so, and then other people don't have family, they're,
well, I think there's good fortune that comes with larger families, with the basic assumption that everybody gets along and contributes even equally, but that's not always the case. It's about needing that sense of connection and community, especially when you're caregiving alone to someone who requires big demands of you. I mean, we learned from the pandemic that isolation was not healthy for large swaths of the population, let alone caregivers post-pandemic. And I think as a species, we really never were developed or meant to exist alone.
No.
And, as far back as we can think or read or study, I think
Yeah.
community in some sort of format is what kept people going.
Right. And I think that's why sometimes it does get hard to figure out where that self-care piece fits in when community care is part of it's like, but there's other people that need me, but there's other, there's other ways, and so I think what, it's not one or the other, it's both. We need self-care so that we can be a part of a community. We need a community so that we can have self-care.
Well, exactly. And sometimes you can surround yourself with a community of individuals who you are caregiving to
Right.
and have no self-care in the end as well. So it's interesting how you can actually fabricate an aura of community, but it's all based on your giving of yourself. But really, you want to have a community.
And the community experts in the world would argue that's not real community, right? That they would
Right.
They would say that's just a bunch of people together.
Right.
And community is something deeper.
Absolutely.
Speaking of community, we had an interesting conversation prior to us recording your podcast about your experience with professional caregivers, and then you've been talking more to non-professional caregivers and just the community of caregivers that is the broader umbrella around professional and family caregivers. And I think, I'm really interested in fostering a community of caregivers that's inclusive of both the professional and the family caregivers, because right now the narrative seems to be out in the world a lot. And by world, I mean on the interwebs. And really, and in encounters I've had in real life with professional caregivers, there's a lot of, it's like, whose side are you on kind of thing. There's like two sides. And I really think, I have been blessed to be around professional caregivers that do invite families in to be part of the caregiving solution, just as the family has been open to inviting people in. So I've been on the positive side of that, but I know a lot of that doesn't happen. So I'd love to talk a little bit more about maybe ways that we can encourage we're in this together mindset versus the,
Well, it's really interesting because, we've trying to conceptualize that sort of in a very holistic way, but then you need to throw in the overtones of politics and healthcare administration and resource scarcity, time scarcity. We were speaking recently with some nursing colleagues about nurse-patient ratios and the moral distress that even cohorts of young nurses go through when they have learned who and what they need to be as a nurse to their patient, and then they enter an environment where they cannot do 60% of the finer elements that truly define the patient-nurse relationship because there's no time, or because the nurse-to-patient ratio that they were, or the patient-to-nurse ratio they were assigned was insurmountable because of short staffing. And then you get pent-up moral distress that sort of follows that young individual who's starting their career. And this is a perfect example. They need some mentorship in the process, obviously. Right. And this came up in discussion recently as well. But if the mentors are overstressed, their capacity to mentor will be reduced. And then if the expectation of the patient and or family is that, well, how come you're only giving me 40% of just the bare basics when there's supposed to be so much more to the health professional family patient encounter? And you can see it just sort of snowballs forward. And everybody in all of this is still human. We bring with us our human strengths and flaws, but you really need to have an awareness of communication and balanced expectation.
Yes.
And if you are pseudo gag ordered to say, you're not allowed telling anybody that we're short staffed because administrators don't want to bear any brunt of responsibility for the schism in the grassroots, ground level patient care provider encounter, you can see where it really gets complicated.
Right.
And it's not about pointing blame at one or the other. It's about having an understanding, but then again, in that sense of community and collectiveness, sitting down and talking with stakeholders, care providers, leaders, and patients and families. How can we sort of fix this in our institution, in our community, in our county or state or province, in our region, in our country, balancing in a very careful act of conversation, honesty, and follow-up. You can't say one thing and then never show up at the table again or blow people off, right?
Right.
You can't say that in a marriage. You can't say that in a parental relationship. You can't say it in a patient caregiver relationship. You can't say that as a leader to the people you're leading. You're by definition not a leader if you do that. So, there's a huge dynamic, but I think it can be saved by just turning back to the basics of decent human interaction.
Yes.
Kind listening and kind actions without fluffy kindness. I mean, accountable kindness, right? And taking the kindness to think about things as straight as possible, considering all parties involved, looking for a happy medium, because any extreme of that will be dysfunctional.
Yeah. I mean, I know that I had many opportunities to be around medical professionals over the course of my mom's life, especially in the last, 10 years, 6 years. It was very, very fraught with hospital stays and ER stay. Like we'd be in the ER, you know, a lot. We would be in the hospital admitted a lot. She would be in the local short-term rehab facilities a lot. And it gave me the opportunity to get to know these people on a different level than probably someone who doesn't get sick very often and just, goes to the ER for a broken bone or, has to be admitted for a minor, an appendectomy or something.
Absolutely. It's a long-term trajectory.
And what I quickly learned, and I am blessed that my mom taught me this, though not explicitly. I just learned from her, to get curious and to get not only about like what's happening, like what's going on with my mother, but also just like about the lives of the people that you're interacting with. And so that allowed us to be seen as human, I think, more, and also see them as human, and just opening up the space like you were talking about before, to be able to just for a moment not be worried about the specific whatever crisis was happening, but just like, oh, this person that's coming in to help my mom is also on hour 12 of a 12-hour shift. They've, whatever. And just taking a moment to be like, see them as a human for like a millisecond before like, what are you going to do for my mom? And also not saying it like that. But anyway, the humanity of people made my mom's professional care experiences so much more precious and sometimes exciting. Like she loved to go to the hospital because she knew that they cared about her there. And not in a general way, but like specifically, these specific people care about me. I know they're not going to let something bad happen.
That's a big leap of faith, probably informed by a lot of positive experiences, but they weren't spontaneous and out of the blue. They were nurtured experiences, just like I think you need to nurture the human encounter between the caregiver and the patient and attest to the humanity of both parties. And you mentioned that really nicely. And, it may not even be an hour 11 to 12-hour shift. It may be 15 of a 16-hour shift.
Or hour 1 of the third shift in the week that's been brutal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with home challenges and everything else that characterizes the human who's coming to work that day. Again, disacknowledging that humanity and those constraints is very conveniently viewed as lack of resilience. And nobody who's a caregiver, I think, can be ever framed as non-resilient, no matter what way they caregive in. I think caregiving and a caregiving mindset breeds resilience.
Yeah.
But it can be broken too.
Yeah.
I've seen it.
Well, and I think, to your point, not everybody's professional care experiences have been were as positive as my mom's. But I will also
not everybody.
I will also say that over the 40 years of care that she had, there were plenty of bad experiences in her, but we both experienced it. She and I both had times where whatever your worst nightmare is, she was going through it as far as like the care she was getting. And the thing that helped us be resilient was the hope that in people that we weren't going to let that bad experience make us believe that everybody was bad people.
Or the whole future journey was
right.
going to be dictated by a new direction.
Right. And also there were times even in where I tried all the tricks that I had learned about treating people as humans and talking to them and getting curious and being on their side and being on their team. And my mom was still getting crappy care. And so
that's a challenge.
But I didn't give up on everything. I just said, okay, well, whatever's going on here, they're just not capable of handling my mom. So I'm going to find another option. And I think that's okay too. Like, I don't think we need to be Pollyanna and act like, nothing's wrong when things are wrong, or keep going, well, it's just the system. So I guess we're just going to have to deal with this BS because of the system. I mean, you can say, yeah, I know the system really stinks. I know, I hear you, but also change my mom's brief. You can do both, and you can have that sense of humanity, and you can talk to them like, hey, well, you got to understand where I'm coming from, right? If this was your mom,
mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? Like, this would be, you would not want this, right? So like, what would you do? And I think that is kind of the resilience that we need as caregivers, is to be, for me, hope and grace for humanity and grace for individuals in my life and myself has gotten me farther than fear and anger and hate ever has. And so in general, I know that sounds like, what are you going to do with that? Like that's a nice little thing to say.
Sure.
But what does that mean? But I think practically speaking, it's just meeting people where they are and then seeing if you can walk alongside them. And sometimes they're not going to move, and then you got to just move without them. That's fine.
I mean, I think in any organized system, there'll be little imperfections here and there, or even sometimes bigger ones which need to be managed. And again, it's a collection of humans who are all working in these big systems, each bringing to the table the expertise they have, not just in terms of command of knowledge, but their expertise in interpersonal interactions and self-management, self-control. I mean, it's complicated.
It's complicated.
And again, going back to that it can't be just one way or the other and nothing in between. But I think what you were alluding to is that you approach the tougher situations with your mom with a degree of elasticity. Yeah. And some of that negativity was sort of had to be born, but it could be gently bounced and sprung back out, and not ultimately disrupting the valuable core of experiences that you had amassed and which, were important for both you and your mom as you navigated the healthcare journey.
Well, and it's funny, I started giggling when you were talking, because there were some time, most of the time I was able to use my, get more flies with honey, attitude to get what my mom needed. But there were also times when I went full, I don't know what you want to say, full screamer. Like I was full, I threw all that out the window and I just went. And not gonna lie, felt good.
Well, it was a catharsis of sorts. Yeah, it was. Right?
But also, I did also learn, okay, well, now I know that, I have a limit of how many times I can, I gave myself permission to, you know, evaluate whether or not that strategy worked, what I might do differently, all of those kind of things. But, you know, it's not about perfection, I guess is my point. There's, we're not going to be perfect. Being a good caregiver does not mean being a perfect caregiver. Being a good system does not mean it's a perfect system.
I can think of, I've had lots of positive experiences in my career. I've had some rough moments as well where patients and or their caregivers were just not in good spaces. We are called to do hard things, and caregiving can be hard. And sometimes we are the recipients of the culmination of lots of difficulties and lots of strains, and among others, and that bounces back against us. I don't think it's about holding grudges.
Yeah.
And it's certainly an acknowledgement. And there's nothing like, I think we're called as caregivers and professionals to be introspective and return back to a difficult situation with a conversation that, shows a willingness to negotiate, but also look to hear some of that in return. I get it. If you're having a rough day and the person you love is not doing well, and I'm at the bedside speaking in tones of gray, because whether we like it or not, medicine is not black and white. It's lots of different tones of gray and probabilities, and the thinking and rationalizing about charting the course is very convenient when there's a black and white decision, but more often than not, in the care of the person and the individual, it's lots of different zones of gray that we need to work our way around. And a lot of loved ones of patients and those involved in their care are not comfortable with that way of thinking. It's not part of their survival schema. And it's very often the one that we use to navigate. We have more and more treatments for some of the chronic conditions that I treat, but we don't have is the DNA, stool, saliva, urine, whichever blood test, that we all take all of those together, put them in a computer. And of these 5 drugs that all work in some people, this is the top choice for this patient. This is second, and this is third.
Right.
Whereas for that patient over there, these are the top 3 that are most likely to work.
Yeah.
That's called personalized medicine or precision medicine. And certainly in my field, it's part of the dream. And I remember always joking with patients as more drugs were discovered that hopefully before I retire, we'll have the luxury of that special machine where I can tell Jack that these are the top 3, and tell Mary those are the top 3 for you. And we're going to pick the drug that's best.
Right.
We're not there yet. And because of that, we engage in a lot of gray zone conversations, because none of the top 5 medications that I use to treat some of the chronic diseases I look after work any better than 70% roughly in any one individual. It's just which one do you pick?
Yeah.
Very, professional conversations involve a lot of gray zone talking, and it's not especially comfortable to have, because patients turn to you and say, how do I make the decision? And
what do you mean you don't know?
And it's like, you can only give your best recommendation without the proverbial, well, if it were me, this is what I would do. And, it's probably not the best way to approach helping patients make decisions, but some rely on you to almost go there. But you sort of put this into an underslept environment where caregivers are stressed. They've got their own lives. They've got their loved one who's amassing various comorbidities and chronic illnesses. More gray zone discussions about availability of extra care. Is it covered on insurance? How can we get extra help? Oh, yes, I need my self-care as well. Oh, yes, this. Oh, that's not available. That person canceled. You can see where the gray juggling wears a caregiver down, wears a patient down, and it can also wear a professional caregiver down. And I think that's just the humanity of it all.
Yeah. As you were talking, it reminded me when my one of my grandfathers, I was blessed to have a few. He was in the hospital, and I have, 6 aunts and uncles on that side. So it was a huge family. And I remember basically being called in as the family doctor translator, because this was like a very healthy family that had not spent much time anywhere around doctors. And so being in the ICU and hearing all these terms all the time. And there was a lot of the gray talk, or, at least general talk, even if it was not really gray, it sounded gray. And my family would be like, Jeanette, you've been around doctors. What are they? Can you just tell us what they're really saying? And I would, have to do a little bit of, translating or just making it clearer for them. But it's interesting that I hadn't thought of it that way, of like, yeah, they're really just in this gray place, and especially in a situation like that where there were a lot of, there's not a right or wrong here. It's just, kind of what y'all think
or
is
the
best.
rightness or the accuracy of the ultimate clinical path may determine by reevaluating the situation every 6 hours for 4 consecutive blocks, and because there's new information that arrives. There's a lot of interest in seeing now whether, if you use the ICU setting, for example, whether those blocks of 6 hours of information about the patient might actually be able to be processed by AI to come up with some very granular abilities to sort of steer management beyond what we're used to doing, even as human caregivers. Yeah. And there's a lot going on.
Yeah, there is. I've been getting a lot of emails lately about the role of AI in caregiving, but that is a whole other episode that we can get on.
I'd love to go there. I know you have a background in technology, and I mean, I think of it as tools. I don't think of it as penultimate solutions.
Right. It's a tool.
We've relied on tools since we lived in caves, right? So here's maybe a tool that stimulates a little bit of extra feeling of connectedness, maybe not pure connection in the purest sense, but every little bit helps.
Yeah.
To just blanket and say, no, we shouldn't do that. It's unhuman.
Well, like with most decisions, I think we should, especially caregiving decisions, they shouldn't be based on fear. They should be based on, data, and then like the circumstances at the time. In my own story, my guilt and fear were making, were guiding my decision making, my decisions. And I had to learn that while I still might have some fear and I still might have a little bit of guilt from time to time, I didn't have to let that be what helped me make decisions. I could let, the circumstances in front of me, what the doctors were telling me, et cetera, what my mom wanted, et cetera, be the driving forces.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the same with AI. Is like we don't have to let fear be the decision maker there. We can be proactive in choosing tools that help us get the results we need, and use them wisely, just like we would use any other tool. Use it for what it's meant for, not for what it's not meant for.
Well, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, Mark, this has been a fantastic conversation. You always make my brain work, which is wonderful. I love that. And I want to let people know how they can find your podcast, get in touch with you, all of those things. So let us know, where can they find the podcast, and what's the best way they can reach out to you?
Well, we're filming episode 10 this afternoon. And, I'm happy to say that we're booking into February for future guests. So we're really excited to be in the space that we are. And I think part of that's really been informed by the vision of wanting this to really be all inclusive when it came to giving and caring, and what those bring out in people, and the humanness of all of it. What unites all of them, those individuals, more than what distinguishes them as separate. So we have our long form on YouTube, and audio-wise, we're on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and you can, those who are interested to see short clips and feed in important moments from the long form, just to stay informed, well, we're on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, and I do have some professional affiliations on LinkedIn as well, and have a professional cadre of people I engage with there too.
Yeah, LinkedIn's becoming the new thing. I mean, it's getting more. I mean, it's not the new thing, but it's becoming more popular. Maybe that's just because of the group I'm hanging out with. I don't know. But anyway, thank you so much, Mark, for joining us. And thank you for joining us today on the From Guilt to Good podcast. To access additional caregiver resources, support our show, or connect with us on social, check out the show notes. Remember, we are changing the conversation around caregiving one episode at a time. You can still be a good caregiver and have a life outside of caring for your parents.